A few years ago, reflecting back on nearly 40 years in public service, Dick Cheney said this: "The path I had traveled was partly due to the circumstance of my birth. Not that I had been born into a powerful or privileged family. I wasn't. But I was born an American, a blessing surely among life's greatest." My dad thought deeply about what this blessing meant, about the duties it imposed. Shortly after he became Secretary of Defense in 1989, he described departing from the Pentagon. "As my helicopter lifted off the Pentagon helipad, I could look across the river to the great monuments of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, to the White House and the Capitol building, where all the great decisions that have shaped 200 years of American history were made. And I could look directly out on Arlington National Cemetery and remember what a terrible price thousands of brave Americans have paid so that all of us could enjoy the blessings of liberty." My dad's devotion to America was deep and substantive. He spent his life studying the history of our great republic. He knew you couldn't truly appreciate what it means to live in freedom if you didn't understand the sacrifices of the generations who came before. And he made sure that his children and grandchildren understood this too. When Mary and I were little, my dad would load up our station wagon on the weekends to take us to visit Civil War battlefields. With the back seat down and no need for seatbelts in those days, we would stretch out, eating Krispy Kreme donuts for breakfast, while my dad drove us to places like Gettysburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Manassas. To be clear, even with the donuts, Mary and I were not enthusiastic participants in these outings. As you might imagine, Dick Cheney read every word of every sign at every battlefield, museum, and national park he ever visited. When you're 5 or 6 years old, this is not your idea of a good time. Mary and I usually moaned and groaned about how long he was taking, and Dick Cheney ignored us. And he just kept reading the signs. He didn't lecture us or demand that we read anything, but we pretty quickly realized no one was going anywhere until he got done. And so we figured we might as well start reading the signs too. And what an education we got. That was the thing about Dick Cheney. He wouldn't force his opinion on you or demand you do things his way. He might not share his opinion at all if you didn't ask. In fact, he was known to go long stretches of time without saying a single word. But if you watched closely, if you asked questions, if you listened when he did speak, you had the experience of seeing the world opening up in front of you, of looking at things in new ways, of benefiting from his clarity of thought, his ability to crystallize what was important and what wasn't. And he was always surprising. Many know the story of his time at Yale. If my dad heard you say he flunked out, he would correct you. No, I was asked to leave. Twice. He took a break from school and he spent several years building power line across the West. I had heard this part of the story my whole life, but it wasn't until I worked with him on his memoirs that I learned how he spent his evenings. At the end of long days, he'd unroll his sleeping bag by a campfire or on a cot in the cook tent, and by the light of his Coleman lantern, he read Winston Churchill's 6-volume history of World War II. By the fall of 1963, Dick Cheney was convinced, some would say threatened, by my mother to return to school. He'd been at the University of Wyoming just a few weeks when he climbed to a seat up near the rafters of the packed field house to hear President John F. Kennedy urge the students to dedicate their lives to the service of our nation. I think this is the moment my dad decided what direction his life should take. Though he was inspired to service by President Kennedy, Dick Cheney became a Republican. But he knew that bonds of party must always yield to the single bond we share as Americans. For him, a choice between defense of the Constitution and defense of your political party was no choice at all. When he was vice president, he wrote in this letter to all of his grandchildren, "As you grow, you will come to understand the sacrifices that each generation makes to preserve freedom and democracy for future generations. And you will assume the important responsibilities of citizens in our society. I ask of you as my grandchildren what I asked of my daughters, that you always strive in your lives to do what is right."